Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Classics Revisited webinar. We are so happy to be continuing this great conversation and providing a work break with more great titles of our world. I'm going to just give everybody a couple of moments to come on in, and then we'll get going. As people come on in, we will be listening to Professor Michael Sugrue's reflections on the sorrows of young Werther by Goethe. We're going to give everyone, once again, a few more moments to log in and get settled. While we do that, please set that chat panel to make sure you're sharing with all attendees and panelists so that everybody can see any comments you might make or any questions you may have. And let us know where you're joining from today. We love to see where everybody is coming from, and we'd love to hear from you too. Published in 1774, Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther is the introduction to Romanticism and highlights the perils of strong emotions and the powers of the human experience. It is a very interesting novel, a very short novel, but opens up a lot of questions about human experience and emotions and how people deal with them. We are looking at today's webinar as a give and take discussion about the sorrows of young Werther, and would love to hear all of the questions that Dr. Sugrue's lecture may inspire. Today, I have the great pleasure to again welcome back Dr. Michael Sugrue to our ongoing webinar series, Classics Revisited. Dr. Sugrue is a professor, is a graduate of the Great Books program. He earned his BA in history from the University of Chicago and his MA, Masters of Philosophy, and PhD in history from Columbia University. Professor Sugrue has taught at prestigious universities such as Princeton, Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and many more. My name is Christy. I'm the Global Marketing Specialist here at Bibliotheca, and always happy to be having this conversation with Michael Sugrue. And behind the scenes on the chat panel today, we have Marie Thorold helping make sure everything runs smoothly. We will be sharing the chat log with all attendees, so make sure you switch that setting to all attendees and panelists so that people can see your comments. If you do have specific questions for the professor, please use the Q&A panel. This will help us filter out who wants to ask the questions. The like button helps float the most popular questions to the top, so please use that feature if you see a similar question or something you just want answered, and we'll work from there. Once again, we are looking forward to today's webinar as a give and take discussion, and would love to hear all of the questions that the lecture may inspire. Now, moving forward, I'm going to hand things over to Michael. So everybody is aware, we did record his reflections in advance, but Dr. Sugrue will join us at the end to take questions. Enjoy the lecture.
Goethe is one of the greatest figures in Western literary history, and he is central to German literature and German culture in the way that Shakespeare dominates Anglophone culture. He is undisputedly the master, and it's not surprising. He was an active politician. He served as a minister of state in Weimar. He was a poet and a philosopher and a scientist. He was a dramatist. He wrote one of the great canonical autobiographies. Everything he wrote seems turned to gold. His Gesammelte Werke, his collected works, amounts to 144 volumes in German. And to say he had a long and productive life really understates how extraordinary his contributions were. For me, one of the most accessible and one of the most memorable of Goethe's works is his early novel of romantic love. And it's a Sturm und Drang novel, which means storm and stress. He's going to show the human psyche under the greatest possible pressures and stresses. And the idea is that these extreme conditions will reveal to us something important about the human condition. Now, apparently we know this was written when Goethe was 23 over the course of 2 months. And it appears to have been prompted by being jilted in love, disappointed in love. If that's the case, he made the best possible use of those 2 months. The novel he produced was immediately acclaimed a classic of European literature, was translated into numerous languages, and went through publication after publication after publication. And the novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, deserved its acclaim and its instant success. And it is a great example of the power of human passions. It's also worth noting that Romanticism, which Goethe is founding here, because this is one of the most important early texts of Romanticism, is looking for a way to render imminent in this worldly the tradition of religious experience, particularly of conversion experience, that goes back to the early days of Christianity. Now, Goethe writes the novel, and this is a stroke of genius, in epistolary form. And that means that it's actually a series of letters from Werther, the hero or anti-hero of the novel, to his friend. And his friend only comes in to narrate at the very end, so we find out his fate. But the only voice we hear in this novel is that of Werther. And that captures beautifully the isolation and also the inability to listen to or hear other people. That's so often the case with people who are in love and subject to very powerful, passionate impulses. So it's hard, or perhaps vain, to talk to someone and try and reason with someone that's in love. And it's true of other people, and perhaps it's true of ourselves as well. In an epistolary novel, Goethe is giving us only one voice and only one perspective. And what's fascinating about the novels, about these letters, and there are many fascinating things, but what we see is the gradual descent from love to madness. And this is a shocking but graded breakdown. And initially, Werther seems like a happy, if romantic, young man. He is reluctant to give up his studies. He loves natural things. He loves trees and children and peasants, like any good romantic hero. He loves Homer. He loves Ossian, the pseudo-epic or poet of the Celts. What he loves is things that are natural, primitive, wholesome. He dislikes bourgeois prudence. He dislikes calculation. He dislikes rationality itself sometimes. And he is then an excellent example of a new kind of hero, not a hero of rationality like Robinson Crusoe. He's going to be a hero of emotion. His emotions are as profound as is possible, and his despair turns out to be terminal. So this is a very powerful and wrenching short novel, executed with the greatest literary style. I mean, it's so beautifully written, it carries you along. The frenzy of love is communicated very well. And the connection between Romanticism and religion becomes very clear. Okay, in the beginning, we see natural, happy Werther reading his Greek Homer, enjoying trees and other romantic pleasures. He is invited to a ball, and they're going to pick up one of the local girls, and he is told before he meets the local girl, whose name is Charlotte or Lotta, not to fall in love with her because she is already betrothed to another man. Now, because this happens in the first few pages of the novel, we know that he has to fall in love with the girl immediately and powerfully and uncontrollably, which is exactly what happens. And the initial scene in which he falls in love, from love at first sight, is worth thinking about. Lotta's mother has died. She's the eldest daughter, and she is loved by all her brothers and sisters, who she takes care of. And when Goethe comes with the coach and his friend to pick her up to go to the ball, she's cutting bread and handing it out to the children, who all look up at her adoringly. Werther is smitten, his heart is taken away, and he is completely transformed. He can worship nothing but her. That's actually the term he uses. She becomes an idol to him. Now, it's worth noting the symbolism here. She could be doing anything, right? She could be calling out for pizza, but she's not. The reason why she's cutting bread and handing it out is because the bread is the Eucharist and she's feminine Jesus. This is a conversion experience. That's what romantic falling in love is. It's a secularized version of the conversion experience. So he's met a new this worldly god, or goddess in this case. And of course, no one can withstand the force of a goddess. He falls deeply and uncontrollably in love, but she has become betrothed to another. She gets a chance to meet the other. And this is, again, a brilliantly written scene. The husband-to-be of Lotta is named Albert, and he is the quintessence, the concentrated version of unimaginative bourgeois calculation. He has no powerful feelings, no real emotions in Werther's view, and it in some ways seems always to be the case in unrequited love, that you can't help but think that whoever your unrequited love is with, that person is just the most profoundly distasteful you can imagine. So romantic Werther and practical prosaic Albert are the two far poles of men and their emotional lives. One very controlled, the other completely tempestuous. So because he cannot cope with the fact that Albert is going to have Lotta, he leaves, takes work for an ambassador. He goes to work at court, and he becomes a kind of general assistant. And he at first likes his job and likes his boss, but eventually he becomes cross and tired and critical and does not appreciate his situation at all. Eventually, he overstays and is present when other aristocrats, genuine aristocrats, are present, and they toss him out of polite society because he is not a Junker, an aristocrat. This crushes Werther and makes him feel utterly alienated from society. So, not knowing which way to go, he goes back to the little village of Walheim, and he sees Lotte again. And once again, he is immediately overwhelmed by his desire for her, which has a deeply spiritual element as well as a carnal element. And he breaks down and embraces her and kisses her, and she pushes him away, saying, "Don't come back until Christmas. We can't do this." Lotte, on her part, was an ordinary common girl who was transformed in Werther's imagination into the most unique and idealized of women. This is characteristic of any young man falling in love. Werther is unable to accept the fact that his one love has rejected him. She, on the other hand, secretly loves him, but can't even admit that to herself, much less to her husband, Albert. She thinks about marrying him off, but then realizes that none of her friends are worthy of him, which is, again, a very strong way of suggesting that she is deeply in love with Werther, who could not be in a way. But on the other hand, she doesn't let herself know that. So here she is, Lotte, trapped by her feelings, trapped by her marriage, trapped by convention, but also trapped by Werther's madness. Werther thinks of no one and nothing but himself. Werther is much more in love with being in love than with Charlotte. Imagine for a second if Albert had never existed and he had been able to woo his beloved and he married Lotte. After 5 or 10 years, they may well still be in love, but it's not the same sort of love that Werther exhibits during the course of this novel. One of the funny facts about human life is that people never love the same way twice. And Werther, whose love is akin to madness and leads to self-destruction, is the most powerful kind of lover, in the sense that he is fully and completely committed. His inability to have Lotte is driving him mad. So he sends a message to Albert and Lotte requesting of her husband, Albert, the use of his dueling pistols, saying in the note that he intends to go on a journey. Now, Lotte gets this note, and she has a powerful certainty that Werther is suicidal. But what can she say to her husband? How can she explain that Werther is suicidal over her? So, crushed internally, she says nothing. Albert, not suspecting anything, says good for him. You know, it's good to do some traveling. He gets the pistols and gives them to his wife, who gives them to the servant, who takes them back to Werther. Now, Werther is going to kill himself at midnight in a kind of black mass. The religious resonances within this kind of self-destructive Romanticism, this irrational or this focus on irrationality, are closely connected to religious enthusiasm. So Werther has a supper, has a servant bring him a meal, and the meal is bread and wine. He eats his last supper, and then he writes a long, astonishingly self-indulgent letter to Lotte, saying, I'm killing myself now, but I don't want you to take it as any grand romantic gesture, because I'm so moved and so powerfully overwhelmed that madness means death for me. I take great pleasure in the thought that the last person to hold these pistols was you, because now I am going to blow my brains out. Please don't be upset. It's just something that's absolutely necessary. In other words, Werther is clearly crazy and in despair, but he doesn't think about anybody but himself. He is extraordinarily egocentric. It's his inability to break out of the prison of the ego that makes him impervious to any of the cures for his unrequited love. Now, at the stroke of midnight, he blows his brains out. This, of course, ought to be the end of the story, but it's not. This is a romantic novel, and we're only, I guess, 90 or 100 pages into this. So now we're going to have, I think, another 15 or 20 pages of Werther writhing around on the floor with a bullet in his brain, with a large bullet injury and brain all over the place and blood spatter. Well, he survives, even though he's in a terminal state. So he's writhing around for hours, and his servant comes to him in the morning, and then he goes and gets Lotte and Albert. He writhes around and bleeds and has brain injury until noon, right? So this was a very long, very extended, very unnecessarily gory a goodbye from Werther. And it also contains what I think is arguably the greatest understatement, the most perfect refusal to speak in the German language, or perhaps in any language. Just before Werther dies, there's one line in which it says, because Lotte and Albert come and see this spectacle of all the blood and brain and the letter saying, I'm glad, that you touched them and all this crazy stuff. Lotte and Albert come, and the final line describing Lotte is, of Lotte's despair or of Lotte's dismay, I will pass over in silence. And it's so perfectly, exquisitely done, because there's no set of words which could possibly capture how bad, how poignant, how pointed this scene is going to have to be for Lotte. And of course, because for Lotte, also for Albert, but in a very different way. The last paragraph is his burial. There are no clergymen attending. He is not given a Christian burial. Why? Because Werther worshipped himself, and that's the reason why he was so taken in his conversion experience by falling in love with Lotte. This is part of the avant-garde of Romanticism, along with Rousseau's first discourse on the arts and sciences. And each of these should be studied in a connected way, if you want to get a sense of what the beginnings of Romanticism look like.
Thank you so much, Professor Sugrue. If you could turn your camera on and join us now, that would be amazing. Wonderful. Hello, sir. How are you today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. And yourself?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. You know, I always feel a little bit guilty because we get about 15, 20 minutes prior to, and especially if I've recently read the book, I get my own one-to-one time with you to touch base on this. And one of the conversations we actually just had to get us started with the Q&A, as people can update their questions in our Q&A panel, is our conversation that we just had about the dangers of internalizing that emotion, how exponentially greater that can come. Now, that's something that we obviously see in the Romanticism movement, of just heightened emotions, heightened passions and everything like that. But can you elaborate a little bit more on that take from Goethe, as well as just how that caused young Werther to go insane?
Well, in some ways, our testing of reality is necessarily mediated by other people. In other words, the way we find out if we're hallucinating or seeing a mirage is asking other people if they see it. And it is really handy to have a rough general consistency between the things you're experiencing and the things the rest of the world is experiencing. It doesn't have to be 100% overlap. We all have our individual moments, I guess, of awe or perhaps unique takes on the world. But for the most part, if you give up on other people's claims about the world, that's another way of defining madness, right? And just because people believe things intensely, it does not actually follow that those things or the beliefs that are connected to them have any reality. So reality is something that it's easy to forsake in the transformative emotions of love. Most of us have had the experience of watching ourselves or one of our friends or one of our children fall in love with what we know is the wrong person, but there's no talking to them. Why? Because they're in love and they do not want to hear other voices. That's what makes an epistolary novel so perfect for this. 90% of the novel is just young Werther talking, and he doesn't really listen to anybody else.
Interesting. So, I mean, like it is an idea of, you know, journaling or diary entry, where sometimes that allows you to release yourself from those emotions. But I know that like all of us have that same thought process of like you start thinking of something and you just can't let it go, and eventually it becomes exponentially greater than what the actual situation is. And clearly that's what happened here with young Werther's love and everything. We did get
Obsession
a question.
Feeds on itself.
Yes. Oh, totally. And it's an interesting take that even in the, you know, late 18th century, you know, at the beginning of this movement, when this was published, that is definitely still part of the human experience and something that was definitely going on. Going off of that, you know, one of the articles that I came across while I was researching this book and preparing for this webinar is that, you know, young Werther is no doubt one of the novels that inspired the Romanticism movement. It's at the very, you know, beginning cusp of that. We hadn't really seen it in drama yet. It was there at the beginning. I came across an article, however, that also compares it to, and this is a quote from the article, providing vocabulary for adolescent turmoil that has stayed with us today. And they reflected that there would be no Catcher in the Rye, for example, or no Rebel Without a Cause without this story. Do you think this is true, or do you think that adolescent emotions are more what helped showcase the raw and heightened emotions of the Romanticism movement, and that movement became known for? So they're so therefore these books, stories, everything in our time period in the 20th century, 21st century are more inspired by the movement itself than by the particular vocabulary used in
That's a great question. I mean, that's a really thoughtful, big question. Let me take a crack at it. I think that Western culture since World War I has been Romanticism Part 2. In other words, I think what we've seen is the same sort of distrust of reason, which is magnified by our dependence on science. There's also a definite fear of it. And there's an emphasis on the ironic, the unusual, and the antinomian, where you make a law unto yourself. This was impressive when the Romantics thought it up, because it looks like something new. Actually, I'm not so convinced that Romanticism is new. What I think it is the Reformation secularized. In other words, you used to have an encounter with God and you fall off your horse on the road to Damascus, and that changes everything. Like St. Augustine, tolle lege. Here, instead of having an encounter with God, you meet your beloved. And that is the secular analog of a conversion experience. And you are now encountering a this worldly God. It's like something out of Euripides, actually. But you see how, there's a definite religious undertone throughout Werther, and it's connected to Catholic rituals. That's not an accident. So I think that we jump from the Reformation to Romanticism, skipping the Enlightenment. And then the last half of the 19th century, I would call it a kind of second Enlightenment. It's an age of positivism and science and technology and, a whole bunch of really great mathematical and scientific discoveries like Maxwell's equations. After the First World War, we lost faith in science and reason, in my view. And as a result, you get ironic art like Dada. All right. And so what Dada is and what the theater of the absurd is leftover Romanticism reheated.
Okay. You spoke numerous times about religious experience, and I had actually prepped a question that you kind of just answered. And it's an interesting take on the sense of that Romanticism might be the secular version of, the religious movement and everything, because in the late 18th century, it was a time for many things, and definitely the church was still very present and very important in the, European nations, especially, but it wasn't necessarily a time that a lot of people think of as religious movement. Religious movement was probably a couple centuries beforehand, the separation of the church, all of that. So, do you think Goethe is making a point with his comparisons to show that the human experience, no matter what it is, can be its own religious movement? Or is it just something that eventually in European literature especially, but in all literature, that religion in essence and one's beliefs eventually tie into that literature?
Again, that's a real big question, but if you think of the tendency towards pantheism in writers like Wordsworth, all right, nature is friendly and numinous. It has not just natural properties, it likes us. On the other hand, when nature doesn't like us, what you get is the last great achievement of American Romanticism, Moby Dick. That's when nature goes crazy as people are crazy, and that's a very negative take on nature. But even there, Moby Dick has some of the qualities of a pagan idol, which is why Queequeg's interpretation and understanding of Moby Dick and the relation he has with Ahab is the center of the novel. I think that there's a religious element running through it. If you just think of something like Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience, did he who made the lamb make thee?
Yeah.
Right, in the tiger. And yeah, it may not be a Christian account of God, but it has deeply religious undertones and valences, and it uses religious imagery, like when Werther has bread and wine for dinner before he kills himself.
For sure.
So yeah, I think that they're connected. My problem is that with 20th century American culture or Western culture, is that it's just leftovers again. Apart from new media like the film or like the internet, the content is kind of stale. All right. Romanticism needs to be shocking.
Yeah, and heightened and that over emotion. Well, I don't want to, take up all of your time with my questions. We definitely have some coming in from the audience, which is amazing. Feel free to keep typing those questions into the Q&A panel. The first question I have from them is, everyone in the story sounds profoundly silly. Are we meant to empathize with any of these characters? What does Goethe do to make readers interested in their fates?
Okay, of course they're silly. What do you expect from people driven by passions they neither control nor acknowledge? All of them are trying to say, oh, well, look, it's a good thing that I don't have that particular problem. Lotte is in denial. Albert would, if he had any wit, be in denial. Goethe or Werther is unable to control his passions, so he, tries various evasions. What was once an existential crisis is now grounds for medical intervention. Nowadays, Werther would be given meds. We would have to, well, no, we don't want him to commit suicide. We're going to have to round off those feelings. And yeah, we're going to give him some pretty heavy prescriptions, probably Lotte as well. And probably Albert is so level-headed because he's already on them. Right? So, profoundly silly, yeah. Profoundly flawed, yeah. Different ways of dealing with the same problem in different ages.
Now, would you say that that is something that is fairly consistent throughout the romantic movement? Because you're dealing with characters that definitely have that heightened human experience, that heightened emotions, that feel things, that see things, that well beyond. I mean, it's part of the exaggeration of the movement to show what life and the human experience can be. So with other novels or plays or poetry that's in that movement, would you say that it's a consistent question for how silly characters can get and if we should be empathizing with them or more learning from them?
The line between the silly and the serious can be razor thin. And while love has its silly qualities, there's also a kind of drawing room drama that can be quite gripping. Stop and think about, say, the novels of Jane Austen. These are written while the Napoleonic Wars are going on. And yet you would never guess that some French general was trying to take over the world. Why? Because we're doing something much more serious here. People are getting married. All right. And so Elizabeth Barrett and Mr. Darcy are heroic characters, and they're tapping into something that is the affirmative, positive version of what Werther tapped into negatively. They managed to overcome the initial feelings of distress and find a way through. He couldn't. But they're both fighting the same battle, and it's a serious battle, quite as serious as Austerlitz. Right? So she's she's making a point in ignoring politics and war.
Switching gears slightly, we have a question that I'm probably going to say one of these words incredibly wrong, so I apologize. Rudolf Steiner was a student and editor of the Goethe's works, and some consider Steiner's Anthropophagy, Goethe's Romanticism, come of age. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, that would just be what I would regard as secondhand romanticism.
Okay.
Right. All those mystical, glow in the dark, woo kind of stuff that we get with Theosophy and Madame Blavatsky and all the rest of that jazz, is a kind of minor current in the late 19th century, when we had what I would call the Second Enlightenment, a new kind of scientism. And it's very easy to meld that into the kind of retread romanticism that is post-World War I to the present Western culture.
Okay. We have a couple of questions about Goethe himself. One starting with actually a question that came in from the registration, which for those of you listening, if you do register, feel free to type in questions that you have initially coming in. And I do my best to get those answered as well. But did Goethe have any impact upon the later existentialists or an influential figure like Nietzsche as regards the perils of their advocating strong emotions?
Yeah. Nietzsche had the highest respect for Goethe, understandably so. He's the greatest. He placed him in the same class as Beethoven, which is a very fair comparison.
Mm-hmm.
Did Goethe have an influence on existentialism? Well, it had an influence on anyone who was raised in the German-speaking world. So if you're Austrian or German and you move towards existentialism, I guess somebody like Heidegger would come to mind. There has to be some influence. I couldn't actually spell it out. I'd have to look and think about it for a while. But in the same way that nobody who writes English, whether they realize it or not, fails to be influenced by Shakespeare. All right. You may try, but he's ubiquitous. I mean, he invents new words that are part of our language. I mean, you just can't get around the guy. There are so many images and so many characters which have become part of our mythos, that the same is certainly going to be true for Goethe and the German-speaking world. I don't know that existentialists spent much time with Goethe because, well, they were so self-absorbed for the most part that although they were, people like Sartre were well-read, they usually looked to themselves for their account of the world. It was highly personal, and that's what makes it Romanticism redux.
Okay. Continuing along the lines with focusing on Goethe for a moment here, is I do have a question from one of our listeners of what is your favorite biography of Goethe? Do you have a favorite in your research?
There's only one answer to that. Poetry and Truth from My Own Life. The best biography of him is his autobiography.
Okay.
It's a commitment. I mean, but it is such an amazing reflection on a genius and his world that while I'm confident that you could learn useful and interesting things from any of the standard biographies, the autobiography of Goethe stands with, I would say, Augustine's Confessions as being one of the great ones in the genre.
Okay. And then another question about Goethe himself is, as a librarian, if someone is looking to get into Goethe, which piece of work would you suggest to them?
Oh boy, there are so many nice choices, and it, to a great extent, depends on who you're talking to, right? When I was a teenager learning German, it had never occurred to me that you could write poetry in German. I mean, I could see how you could do economics or physics in German and be great at it. It's a perfect language for that. But I could see how you could write poetry in Latin, but not German. And then one day my teacher gave me a poem by Goethe, and it just shocked me. It was, I think it's called Roslein. and that means it's the diminutive form of rose, and the meter of it is so beautiful that you can immediately pick up the music inside it. It goes Roslein, 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 Roslein von der Heide. Little rose, little rose, little rose, little rose, little rose from up in the heather. His poetry is amazingly good. In other words, it's in the same league as Shakespeare's sonnets, which is desperately great.
Oh yeah.
You could look at his autobiography, but I would start with most people with Werther.
Okay.
It's accessible. It's a 2-hour read, and hardly anyone doesn't have a strong opinion about it.
And on that, one of the questions that I know tends to come in, so I just wrote it down myself. Translations like the Sorrows of Young Werther has been translated from the beginning. Like it was translated almost right away into multiple languages. Is there a particular translation, even if it's a translation because of the notes that are included with the translation, that you may suggest for someone who's looking at it?
Well, I like the translation that I forget who made it. That's in that 12-volume Princeton. How can I put it? Reduced collected works. In other words, his Gesammelte Werke is 144, and I don't know where to find it in there. But the translation into English in the Princeton volume is one of my favorites. So I would start there.
Okay. Moving a little bit back into the novel itself, you and I managed to speak a little bit prior to this about the fact that it is considered factual that Goethe himself had an unrequited love that obviously did not end in suicide, but moved forward. We have a question here of, do you think that Goethe wrote this novel as a kind of catharsis for his own feelings at that time?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's so obvious, so transparent. I mean, this is a young man's book. Nobody my age can generate, I mean, no matter what his literary abilities, could generate that kind of intensity. You have to be feeling the heat from this as you're doing it. So yeah, this was the most constructive and healing and brilliant catharsis you could possibly imagine. Most people, when they get jilted in love or hurt in love, and pretty much that's the human condition, almost nobody goes through life without ever experiencing that. We mope around for a couple of months and get nothing accomplished. We complain. He decides, why don't I write one of the great novels in the Western tradition? Now he's 24 years old. This is nice work if you can invent it. And immediately becomes a celebrated figure, and then goes on to become a statesman, a practical politician, a scientist, a dramatist, a novelist, a biographer, a travel writer. I mean, the number of things that he could do is in the same league, perhaps, as somebody like that's genuinely an intellectual great, like Plato. He has so astonishing varied in his talents that you almost can't go wrong where you start. But I think that the easily accessible thing like a novel is better unless they read German, in which case you might want to give them some of the poetry because it's amazing.
Okay. We have a question here that I kind of chuckle at too, because it's something that went through my mind for sure when I saw publication dates. And it's from, I'm sitting here in Sudbury, Massachusetts, about 4 miles from the Rood Bridge where the American Revolution began on April 19, 1776. Werther was published in 1774. Is there a connection between those, or probably what was going on in the world at the time? French Revolution was only a few years away as well.
Yeah. There's, as far as I know, no connection between revolutionary America and this novel. But that may just be the limitations of my knowledge. With regard to the French Revolution, it depends on what you see, how you view the French Revolution. Right? It is arguably the high point, the kind of apogee of the Enlightenment. We are going to subject politics and the human world to the domain of reason, or to the force of reason, in the same way we recently have done this with the force of reason imposed upon nature. Okay. Now, the problem, of course, is that what this great rationality leads to is terror and mass murder, right? I mean, not just 40,000 to the guillotine, but in the surrounding provinces, well over 100,000 people get killed in the de-Christianization movement that's associated with the terror. So here we have what could be thought of as the apogee of reason. Also, you can think of it as the collapse of reason. All right. They went too far, and their hubris drove them to unreasonable butchery. So a lot of it hangs on what you think the French Revolution is. Now, the problem is it's both. It is the end of the Enlightenment. It's the high point of the Enlightenment, but it also is the low point of the Enlightenment because it shows that reason was oversold, right? Reason is a great thing, but it's not going to solve all the problems in human life. And so when it doesn't, people say, we won't get fooled again, like that Who song says. And that's what drives Romanticism. They see the French Revolution as being the outcome of people being too reasonable.
Okay.
Thus, you get a romantic political writer like Burke.
I have two questions here that kind of delve in a little bit more in depth in things that you've said. One is, so the hippie movement extended Romanticism, but could you re-explain your concept that Dada is an extension of Romanticism?
Sure. Dada is the inverse of what was going on in Western philosophy. In philosophy, we were getting things like the Vienna Circle, which raised logic and science to the status of final answers, and it sort of deified reason. And since it was interested in clarity, they made claims that they clearly couldn't justify. Dada went the opposite way. They said, we reject all of reason. Reason brought us World War I. Reason will reinstate the evils that drove society to this level. Nothing makes sense. All the old attempts to form a coherent world have led to mechanized destruction in the form of machine guns. So we're going to embrace the ironic, the incoherent, the absurd. And so much of literature has gone the same way, the theater of the absurd in particular, or existentialist novels where the hero has to do something because he's so forlorn and isolated and alone, and there's no guidance. So he does what he chooses to do and revels in his individuality. Can you see how so much of this is derived from things like Werther? Or if you think of The Red and the Black by Stendhal.
Okay. And then another asking for a little bit more reflections on some of the religious comparisons you made. The comment is, true faith conversion may start with exuberant passion, but if it is a true faith, it settles into an other-centered, God-centered, sacrificial lifestyle. I feel like you're comparing young passion to a conversion experience falls short when it's unrequited and cannot mature into true love, where one puts the needs of the other first. Does Goethe show the contrast of selfish, blind passion and true other-centered sacrificial love, or does Goethe not believe that is possible?
It's a very complicated question. Certainly, the kind of love that Werther is capable of producing is defective because he lives in a wilderness of mirrors. Wherever he goes, whatever he encounters, it's all a funhouse reflection of himself. All right. So, in some ways, his romanticism has left him defective in the ability to impose a kind of network of reason over his inchoate feelings. And one definition of mental illness or mental defect is the inability to connect feeling and fact. All right. And I'm inclined to think that you're right, that there are more than one kind of love. I think I said in the lecture that people never love the same way twice. His is a very immature adolescent love. There's no doubt about that. Because he killed himself, he never got a chance to develop the more reflective and perhaps more chastened version of love, where you can't always get what you want and it isn't always about you. It's part of the tragedy of suicide.
And it definitely stops the path of that possible deep conversion.
Yep.
You start getting the enlightenment in there for the conversion factor, but maybe not becoming a true believer in the end or in the long run.
You're right.
If you're willing to kill yourself before you put someone else's needs before your own.
The God he worships is him.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And final question that we have from the audience is, can you comment on Goethe's less known scientific work, for example, in the area of light, where he disputed Newton's and came up with his own theory of light?
Yeah, he was a remarkable polymath. It's impossible to put him in a box. He could create literary works that are comparable to the greatest anywhere, Shakespeare or Aeschylus. I mean, truly great works. But it didn't stop there. He was interested in a number of the natural sciences, the first of which was botany. Strangely enough, what he saw when he looked at plants, particularly in very well-tended gardens, is the regular geometric structure by which plants generate leaves. And no matter how the leaves vary, there is inevitably an internal geometry. So one of the things that he wanted to do was to write a book about the geometrical structure of plant growth, which shows you again what kind of a mind we have here. It's a remarkable idea. It's true too. In addition to that, he also spent a great deal of time thinking about and occasionally experimenting with light. He read Newton's Principia Mathematica and understood it, which immediately tells you what you're dealing with here. Well, no, I mean, many important German intellectuals did. Kant, roughly a contemporary, also read Newton's Principia and understood it and had the most profound effect on his moral philosophy. But in the case of Goethe, he looked at this and said, no, there's a problem with the theory of light here. Newton believes that that the various angles of refraction are what accounts for the difference in colors that we see in the spectrum. And in that respect, it's an extension of Pythagoras's project that he began when he heard different size hammers and found out that sound had numbers in it. Well, Newton looked at light and said, wow, light has numbers in it. That's what color is. Mm-hmm. Well, Goethe had objections to this account and needed to go back to the kind of raw data of color so that he could offer an alternative account that I must confess, I do not understand. I have not taken it that far, but it turns out not to have been effective for the science of light. And as far as I know, the great line that he gives is the last line he gives us on his deathbed, which says to his attendant, more light, and then dies.
Well, Goethe sounds like a very almost a Renaissance man of himself, in the sense of what he wrote about, what he was able to write about. And I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us about not only the Stars of and Werther, but also Goethe himself. It's been very, very interesting. So thank you so much for this great conversation.
Well, thank you.
We do have, for those of you still listening, we do have another work break coming up on April 6th with the Pulitzer Prize winning, March 16th. I'm switching it up. We have two work breaks coming up, one with the professor, one with another author. March 16th at 11 a.m. with Pulitzer Prize winning author Jumpa Lahiri, I believe is how you pronounce her name. Our VP of Cloud Library Collection Development, Heather McCormick, will be having a conversation with her and opening up to live Q&A throughout the hour. If you are still enjoying our Classics Revisited series, we do have 4 more coming up in this first half of the year with Professor Sugrue. We will be continuing the series with our next webinar being on April 6th. That will be Robinson Crusoe. Titles we will be featuring in the first half of 2021 also include A Clockwork Orange, Brave New World, Robinson Crusoe, and a couple more. Please keep an eye on our website for dates and times of our upcoming webinars. All of our Classics Revisited series are available on YouTube. This allows you to share the webinars with with other staff, as well as any patrons that may be requesting information about Goethe or Orwell or any of the other authors that we have been very lucky to talk to the professor about. If the dates and times don't work for you, you can always check out our YouTube channel, or dates and times don't work for you for any of our other webinars, please visit our website and you can see the on-demand viewing. Just go to bibliotheca.com/events for more information about all of our webinars. And finally, as we finish today, and as you log out, thank you again for taking this work break with us. There will be a quick survey that pops up. It should take only about a minute to fill out. But if you're enjoying these breaks, or if you have suggestions of future books that we could possibly integrate into our series, we love to hear from you. We love to hear all of those comments as well. This was kind of a risk that we took back in October, and we've just loved the response and the feedback and the ability to have these conversations with the professor, as well as with all of you guys. It's some great questions that come through, and just nice to chat about books. And with that, from everyone at Bibliotheca, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Michael, again for leading today's discussion. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.